Fearless. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Rebecca Schramm, Director of Workplace Experiences for VICO, and we hope you brought your list of shoulda, coulda, wouldas so you can turn your failures into successes. Please join me in welcoming award-winning journalist Emily Schmidt, who's also a communications specialist. Emily has led media training, public speaking, crisis management for numerous organizations. She's going to share with us how our mistakes can lead to the most valuable lessons and make us even better than ever. So with that, Emily, we'll have you take the show. Everyone, feel free to put your questions into the chat and we'll answer them as we go or at the end.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks to everybody who is joining in today. I will do my best to be able to see where the chat is in the Zoom, but as I share my screen, I may miss it. So feel free to send it to Rebecca. She will interrupt. She has carte blanche to do so because I would rather have this be as much of a conversation as we can as possible. We're talking today about this concept of mistaken identity because there's this idea of turning failure into fearlessness that I think is really important. In fact, I've worked with Bico and its team a number of times. I've worked with a lot of executives on this idea. I'm going to be working from a book that if you're looking for a good book to kind of inspire you for the next few months or for your year ahead. It's by Matthew Syed and it's called Black Box Thinking. And it's really taking a look at how you learn from your mistakes. This can be a scary place to be because a lot of us don't like to think of ourselves as people who fail, but we do in hopefully little ways or certainly in big ways that happen every once in a while. We want to take today to think about how to do this. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it's part of life. If you take a look at a lot of statistics, they say 21 days into January, there's a pretty good chance that 80% of us who set New Year's resolution goals just 3 weeks ago probably will not have any of those goals still in place by the time February 1st comes around. We have high hopes for ourselves, but sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit and grace to figure out how we can succeed. We just say, well, that didn't work, so it's done until next December 31st. So I think part of this is this time of year is a good time to look at how do I define failure and how do I go. The other part that I think is really important is as you're looking to grow this year, maybe how to grow your team, how to grow your business, how to grow yourself, it really can help to have this change in perspective. How can you learn from your mistakes? One quick point here. Look, nobody likes to fail, and sometimes you can't, right? If you are in manufacturing, you want to have as close to 100% perfection rate as you can. So I'm not saying go out and make mistakes and there's no repercussions. Sometimes there are, but this is more how we think about those little things that we do. How do we go through, set our goals, plans, and actions, and figure out where we're going? Because really the F word in our lives tends to have a lot of negative connotations. We think of F as a failing grade. If your kid comes home with an F, if you ever didn't do well on a test, this was a pretty rough letter to look at. It meant something to ourselves that we hadn't measured up. So what I want you to do today is start thinking of the F word instead of failure to fearlessness and how you get there. There's one quick thing that I would love to get your ideas on this. And so if you have a phone, if you could go to menti.com, that's MENTI.com. When you go, there'll be a little message that says, hey, put in this code. And so the code we're going to use here is 4581148. And I would love for you, you'll get this little sliding scale to let me know how comfortable you are failing. And I don't want you to fail in terms of where we're going to think of failure by the time this hour is over. But right now, if somebody came up to you and said, you just failed at that, how comfortable would you feel with this? We should start to see, as you do this, some sliding scales come into play as we'll get some real-time results.
Could we get that code again, please?
The code at menti, MENTI.com. Can you see my screen is 4581148. I'm just going to give you a second to see if we start to see some real-time results coming up here. showing up? If it doesn't, we can move on. What you should be able to see are some real-time numbers that for some reason aren't coming up that really go and tend to show that most of us tend to go on the part that say strongly disagree. We may not be very comfortable with failing and going through this. It's this feeling that I get right now when this screen that worked before isn't working at the moment. It doesn't feel great. You think, okay, do I throw this out the next time? No, you learn from it and you go from there. But comfortable failure isn't something that we have a lot of. I want to tell you two stories about failure. The first one is one that came before what happened here. And I was working with a Fortune 500 company, and they were doing stories about innovation. And they came to me and said, "We would love for you to highlight one of our employees." And I said, "Well, great. I'd love to do a video about them. Tell me about this employee." And they said, "This employee came to our company, sold their business so that they could bring a big idea to our company. It was in our pipeline. Our board of directors talked about it in their quarterly earnings report. And then it turned out that the product failed." And I said, "Wait a second, it didn't work?" And they said, "Right." And I said, "You want me to do a story about an employee that it didn't work?" And I said, yeah, that's it exactly. We want you to talk about how they learned to fail and how they failed successfully. So it was kind of an interesting concept. And I went to the employee and I said, "Listen, the company would love to focus on you." And they said, "Well, that's fantastic. I really look forward to this. What about?" I told them, and they said they did not want to be the subject of a video about failure. They didn't want to have their colleagues all around the world show that they had tried something that didn't succeed. But when we got a little bit deeper, we said, "Listen, we want to talk about how you went through the process of making tough decisions, when you decided to make the call, how you failed fast enough that it helped the company move on, move to a different thing that became very successful." And so when we did that, this turned out to be the most well-received video that we had ever done in the history of years of working with the company. Employees responded to the idea of saying, "Sometimes things don't work out the way we planned. Here's how you can fail better. Here's how you can create a culture that gets us to success faster." In the end, the employee, as we were highlighting what had seemed to them to be kind of the low light of their career, this really turned out to be something that made them stand out in the company as a clear success. And as they were given credit for that, they've actually gone on to do some of the most innovative, well received, successful things in the company. And so I think that's the background I want you to think about this is, can you start to frame, are you failing in the way that you like? This picture is definitely a story of that. I like to travel with my kids, and my husband and I do. And this was this summer when we weren't able to go abroad. We went to a number of national parks because we could do so and be socially distant away from people. For any of you who've been here, you may recognize this is the Great
Emily, we
Sand.
can't
Yes,
see your image. We can't see.
really. Let's try it again. Let's try it from this slide. Are you seeing it here?
We just see you. The screen share is not on for us.
Let's see what's happening there. Are you getting it now?
Yes, it's now coming up.
Okay. Well, that may be why the other one didn't show up as well, but we'll try this from this point. Thanks, Rebecca. Let me do it from this slide. Still showing? Okay.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. So this was at the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. And if you can tell, my kids are on two different kinds of boards. If you want to go sledding or sandboarding on these dunes, it's something that you rent right outside of the park. And you go, and when you climb these dunes, so you can't tell this from this picture, they are 40 or 50 stories high. You're a long ways up in the air. And so my oldest son really wanted to sled, and that's what he is holding. My youngest son really wanted to go sandboarding, which seemed like a great idea, except for the fact that he had never even been on skis or been on a snowboard. He had no idea what he was doing. And when we went to rent the sandboard, the man at the counter said, listen, if you are 11 years old and you've never done this before, you do not want to sandboard out here. It's going to be a really bad experience. And so we, listening to that man, said, you're not going to rent a sandboard. That's just not going to work. And my son said, yes, I'm going to do it. So finally, he convinced us. We rented that. And he went up to the top of one of these dunes and went down, and he fell down. And so then he said, well, I'll try it again. He did it again. He fell down. He did it a third time. And after the third fail, he was ready to give up, and we were ready to give up on him. We were at the point of saying, I told you so. We told you you could not do it. And look what happened. It was my older son who stepped in and said, listen, I've never snowboarded before or sandboarded, but here's what I've seen when I'm at the ski slopes, and here's what I think you should try. It was him stepping in and saying, this is not going to be a failure. Let's try it, that helped my younger son learn how to do it. And in the end, after that third fall, he never fell again. He was going down these huge dunes, having an amazing time. And he learned what failure meant when he tried and tried again. And I and my husband learned what we kind of were doing as failures as parents, which was saying, yeah, we were told that you couldn't do it. You can't do it. See, that's right. Instead of saying, is there another way to look at this as a learning opportunity? So from the end, the failure got erased on my son's side because he was able to sandboard. The failure got erased on our side because we learned that this was not our best parenting moment. And so I think that's one of the things that's really critical here, of when you think of F, turning it into the failure, I couldn't do it, to fearlessness. If I keep working at this, I can make it down those sand dunes. I can encourage a team member to do that. And failure is something I thought a lot about yesterday. I'm not going to have a political conversation here by any stretch of the imagination, but I was covering the inauguration and I was on the National Mall, and I looked at this picture that was happening just a couple of miles away at Arlington National Cemetery. And if you see this picture, you will see that there are 4 presidents or former presidents in this shot. And so I was looking at this picture, thinking about this conversation that we were going to have about failure. And I started thinking about the political history of each one of these people. If you think in 1974, Bill Clinton ran for a House of Representatives race and he lost it. In 1978, George W. Bush ran for a House of Representatives seat and he lost it. If you look in 2000, Barack Obama ran for an Illinois congressional seat and he lost it. And if you look at Joe Biden, who yesterday took the oath of office, he had run for president 2 times before, back in 1988, 20 years later in 2008, and then 12 years later as he ran in 2020. And he had lost 2 times before getting to this point. Failure is something that even people who we may consider a success deal with all the time. So why do we let it define us so much? I want you to watch one quick video thinking also about people who were failures and learn to take that on and challenge themselves differently. So this is a little bit of a quiz. As you're watching this, see if you can identify who they're talking about.
After being cut from his high school basketball team, he went home, locked himself in his room, and cried. He wasn't able to speak until he was almost 4 years old, and his teachers said he would never amount to much. Was demoted from her job as a news anchor because she wasn't fit for television. Fired from a newspaper for lacking imagination and having no original ideas. At age 11, he was cut from his team after being diagnosed with a growth hormone deficiency, which made him smaller in stature than most kids his age. At 30 years old, he was left devastated and depressed after being unceremoniously removed from the company he started. A high school dropout whose personal struggles with drugs and poverty culminated in an unsuccessful suicide attempt. A teacher told him he was too stupid to learn anything, and that he should go into a field where he might succeed by virtue of his pleasant personality. Rejected by Decca recording studios, who said, "We don't like their sound. They have no future in show business." His first book was rejected by 27 publishers. His fiancée died, failed in business, had a nervous breakdown, and was defeated in 8 elections. If you've never failed, you've never tried anything new.
I think as we watch this video, you start to look and say, listen, everybody fails, but somehow that still doesn't make it any easier when it's us. When you know people who have really tried for that promotion, or maybe it's you who's really tried to get that dream job and you make the final cut and then they go with somebody else. It's really hard not to take that as a failure. When you are the person who has come to a company and said, this is the project that I believe in, this is something I'm going to take the lead on, and it doesn't get picked up for budgetary reasons, or it gets picked up and it just doesn't have the resonance that you want, it's really hard not to take that personally. So what we're going to talk about today is how you can start to learn from what's working to make it work better for you. I think Jeff Bezos says it really well with Amazon. Failure comes part and parcel with invention. This isn't optional. They're talking about failing early, reiterating until we get it right. That's much the same way as happened with the person who I featured in the video for the Fortune 500 company. This idea of, listen, it's about what you learn from this. How quickly do you learn from it? And how do we keep working on it until we get it right? So this book on black box thinking is a really good way. And we're going to talk today about 4 ways that you can start to think about learning from failures differently. But first of all, we have to kind of establish a line here of what is an aircraft black box. You've probably heard about this a number of times. It's that flight recorder that takes all of the data that's happening on a plane and records it, so that if the plane goes down, there's an opportunity to listen in and hear what's going on. As a journalist, I have listened to some of the data that comes from black box recordings and heard how that is used to help solve crimes, to help answer the question as to what went wrong. The aircraft black box is really important for doing that. You see it in headlines. When there was a story about Ethiopian Airlines and the Lion Air crashes, they were looking at the black box to provide the data that, of course, people who were on the plane were unable to provide, as there had been no survivors. But has anyone ever seen what a black box looks like? We're talking about black box thinking. Anybody know what they look like? I want to show you. This is a black box. And if you see this for the first time, you may be saying, how did it get its name? It's orange. That is not what I would call a black box. The thing that's fascinating about this is even black boxes are part of black box thinking, because they used to be black and then they were doing looking for them in the bottom of bodies of water or spread out across huge areas of land and fields. And it was really hard to see a box that was black. So they painted them orange simply to make them easier to identify. So even this very idea of looking back at data and seeing what it can teach you for the future, there's an example of how the black box was changed to make it easier. This is what we're talking about. How can you make changes to make things better? So black box thinking is really saying, There are lessons that happen when we fail, but so often we are ready to put those aside and forget that anything bad ever happened, that we don't take a look at, is there something we can learn from this to do better the next time? This can work for ourselves. It's also about creating systems and cultures and organizations that can make things run better. So as we go through these next 4 steps, I want you to think about this in 2 ways. Think of the last time you tried something new and it didn't work. And do you have a personal example of that you can think of how you could apply that? Or do you have a professional one of something that just didn't work, or something that you see not working with your employment that you could say, how could we create a system to make things work better? And these are the quick 4 topics that we are going to look at over the next few minutes. Marginal gains, where you're just changing a little bit along the way and ultimately getting to some big changes in the end. Avoiding closed loops, looking at the idea of blame, who's at fault here, and the idea of try again. None of these are fun exactly in and of themselves, because it takes something not working to take a look at how could it work better. But if you instead just say, let's hope it never happens again, that we don't have that problem, we know that that doesn't necessarily work all that well. So I want you to think about this, even in terms of this cartoon. I find that if you want to reach your goal sooner, you double your failure rate. Double your failure rate to reach your goal sooner. In science, when I talk with scientists, this is how they live. This is not a mind-blowing concept to them. They know that, for example, if they're doing drug development, what it's taken to get a vaccine for COVID-19, scientists talk about, isn't that it worked from the beginning. It's that it had to fail and fail and fail. But from each failure, they were learning something new that have gotten us to the point that we are starting to see the first people receive vaccinations. You have to double your failure rate sometimes to reach your goal sooner. So the idea of marginal gains comes into play. What is that? It's basically saying, if we look at something closely enough, what are the little tiny things that aren't working? And how can we improve just one little tiny thing to make it work? Quick example of this was Google. Now, if you pulled up on your phone right now, google.com, and looked at it, my guess is you've never thought about what color the web link is that exists, the thing that you click on to get you to wherever you want to go. But Google took a look at this and they said, okay, which shade of blue might appeal to people the most? It turned out that they tweaked their links just to a little greener shade of blue. What difference does it make, right? How much would that make a difference? They believe that that generated an estimated $200 million in annual revenue. Huge impact in terms of dollars, just because somebody said, could there be a consumer behavior difference between how much we like a color blue? We may not all have the opportunity to ask a question like that and come up with a fifth of $1 billion impact, but this is something that can happen so much in what we're doing. If you're saying, I don't have enough time during COVID, it feels like I just can't get everything done. You probably can't add 6 hours to your week easily, but can you add 10 minutes to each day, or 10 minutes to your morning, by going through your email differently, by shutting down all of your other boxes to make sure that you don't click on a sale at Best Buy instead of, and lose that 10 minutes around. Tiny differences that over time can make a much bigger change than saying, I need to find an extra 10 hours in my week. This is a way that can help you work through things that are feeling like they're not working for you much more simple. Here's the way to think about how to make this, that edict of how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. What they basically say is, if it was possible to make a 1% improvement in a whole host of areas, the cumulative gains would end up being hugely significant. This is something that can have a big difference in your personal health. It might be when you're saying, I'm going to try to eat one more fruit a day, or one fewer soda a day, or I'm going to take one meeting a week that's a lunch meeting that I'm walking on my phone and going for a walk instead of sitting in my home office. How can you do one thing that eventually starts to have that cumulative effect? I think of all of the changes that we're talking about, marginal gains is one of the best ways to start to flip how you're looking at failure to fearlessness, because it doesn't take a heroic measure. It doesn't take having to completely rethink what you do, how you do it. It's saying, is there one way to do it? I think the other thing that's critical here is if you have a team, this is a great one to address with brainstorming. What's one thing that we could do to engage with each other better when we're in a virtual world and we can't see everybody? You can't have a huge difference by saying we're all going to have a happy hour in the office, because it's just not possible potentially. So what's something that you can do that's small that makes you feel more connected to your employees? There's a great power of brainstorming and systemic change that can come when everybody thinks of one little tweak that can happen. And finally, for an example of that, as a public speaking coach, this is what I see and this is what I work with, and where you help people overcome fear all of the time. Very few people love to get up in front of an audience and give a speech, even if they're the most confident. They're afraid to do it. So you don't say, we're going to make you a great speaker. We're going to change everything about you and make you speak the way Oprah Winfrey might speak, or Barack Obama, or George W. Bush. We're not going to make you somebody else. But what we're going to say is, could we make you slow down just a bit so people listen to you? Or could we make you find one story that really motivates you, that you think will motivate other people? Can we come up with one little thing that you can focus on? That makes them better for one speech. And then we focus on the next thing to build them up for the next. You're never going to make someone a great public speaker by throwing out everything they've ever done and recreating them. You're going to do it step by step and build their confidence. Marginal gains is a great way to change from fear and failure into fearlessness. Number 2, I think, is particularly relevant in the world that we live in right now, because I think it's so easy for us to understand. Avoiding closed loops. Have you ever had something where everybody on a team works so hard together to come up with an idea, come up with a solution, and they've worked really hard at it and they feel really good about it? And then they present it and everyone else says, you spent all that time for that? That's not really our problem. That's not what we need solved. You missed the point. That could happen because it was a closed loop. The people who were working together never stopped to get the perspective of somebody else. I think one of the quickest ways to look at this is to think of your social media feeds that could be going on right now. I only chose Facebook and Twitter, but we could go with a whole host of others, from Parler to Instagram to you name it. There are so many different social media things, but how many people on your social media feed do you have that believe exactly what you believe? And how do you feel if you see someone who believes something differently? Again, a non-political conversation, but one of the things that we are seeing researchers taking a look at is how are people influenced when they kind of work in this echo chamber where everything they hear is from somebody else who believes what they believe. So they're not willing to see what else is out there. This idea of a closed loop can be especially dangerous when it comes to failure, because you haven't taken the time to ask everybody else how they feel about it, how it may impact them. This is an example. If we could all be together, I would do an exercise with you, but this is one that I did with a team of leaders that I was working on. I want to show you what happens when a closed loop comes into play. I gave everybody a single piece of paper. And if you can do this with teams, there's a coin shortage now, so it's a little harder to get these coins from a bank. But this is a super simple exercise to look at how failure can happen when you have a closed loop. So I gave everybody a bunch of rolls of money. I gave them a single piece of paper, and 2 notebooks and said, you have as many, they could only work with the single piece of paper, but they had a stack. They could try as many options as they had to see how many coins they could get to balance on that single piece of paper without it folding and touching the table beneath them. So this, what you see behind me, is what happened with 3 different groups. The first group basically couldn't see the other people, didn't see what happened, and said, here is our solution. And they felt pretty good about it. When you took a look at the money, there's about $2.30 worth of change that they had. And they did this and they said, this is pretty great. We feel great about how this happened. And they stopped. And they said, that's what we have. So $2.30 is awfully good for that solution. But what was fascinating was there was another team that was working, and they kind of kept an eye on what the first team was doing. And they saw what happened when they quit and said, hey, can I take a look? They came up with a different way to fold the money. And when they did, they came up with about $5 worth of money that they were able to balance on this paper. You can see that because they had opened up their loop, they weren't just happy with what they had. They started to say, is there a better way? Do you think we could learn from this? They more than doubled the amount of money that they got. But then there was a third team that continued to work, and they worked longer than anybody else. And the first way they did it wasn't working very well, so they kept folding it, they kept brainstorming, they worked. And if you look at that pile of change on the right-hand side, same kind of paper, same distance that was happening between this, they came up with about $9 worth of change that they were able to balance, almost 4 times more than the first group. This is what happened when they opened the loop, when they went from saying, wow, we did a really good job, to saying, how could we do better? What have other people done? How can we learn from this? It was exponentially a different amount of success that they had. And so I think this is one of the places where we have to hold ourselves accountable and say, are we looking for better ways to do things? And who are we asking? And are they people who may not be the ones that we're most likely to know? If you think of networking and those who network by asking only the people that they've worked with before, who do you know that could have a job for me? Who do you know that would have a great place? Everyone's going to recommend the same person because they're all within the same loop. But if you have friends and networks across all kinds of industries, across all kinds of areas, and you say, who do you know who I should know? You're much more likely to have beyond that closed loop and get to find out more about what's going on. This can be really critical in helping you get from why isn't this working? Why did this fail? To how can we look at this differently and succeed? So I encourage you to look at your loops and see how closed or open they may be. The next one is no blame, no shame. And the blame game, think about the last time that you saw something fail. What happened? You may have asked what went wrong. More than likely, you said, who was responsible for this, right? Who made this happen? And that blame game can be really something that keeps people from wanting to learn from failure. Because I don't want to be the person who screwed up. You probably don't want to be the person who screwed up. And it's a lot more comfortable to say, well, it was that person over there. But the fear and blame is a really big obstacle on the road to success. There's a great Harvard Business Review article from a few years ago, and I'm happy to send you a link if you would like. It said, listen, they talked to executives and they said, we know you know that things go wrong sometimes. So how often do you think that what went wrong is really, it was this person's fault? It is blameworthy. It needs to be called out that they did something absolutely wrong. And the executive said, that probably really only happens 2 to 5% of the time. In other words, 95 to 98% of the time, yes, mistakes happened, but it wasn't because someone intentionally did something with such ill intent that it's worth pointing out. It's because You had to just learn, and it's just part of doing business. So 2 to 5% isn't that bad, right? You should be able to know that most of the time you're not going to be to blame. But then listen to this. I will, Nancy, I'm seeing send a link on the article. I will look that up and get that out to Biko and Flourish to send out later. But here's the same part of the study when they said how many of the things that happened. Remember that 95 to 98%. How many are treated as blameworthy? Those executives said, well, 70 to 90% of the time, probably we're pointing fingers. People are looking for someone to blame. This is a really fascinating number because this is coming from chief executives. These are coming from people who say most of the time, nobody should really be blamed for this, but somebody is looking to pin it on somebody else almost all of the time. This is the blame culture that can really come into play here. When you're pointing the finger and saying, I need somebody to be called out on this, even if they are trying to do their best, you're not going to have the chance of sharing information for progress. You may think of what could happen here. If you're reading the book, they talk a lot about medical mistakes. If people are trying to not own up to seeing a process that doesn't work because they're afraid that if they point it out, they are going to be picked on or there'll be some kind of retribution about them. If they're not speaking up, how do you know that the next patient won't have the same mistake that happens to them? And if you want to look at this in just a real life example, imagine if you as a student had come home and told your parents that you had a failing grade. Or if you are a parent, imagine if your kid comes home and said, I have a failing grade. Most of us, our first reaction would probably be like, what did you do? Aren't you studying? What's going on? And we're looking to blame them for the fault instead of saying, okay, something's not working here. Can you explain to me what you're seeing? What do you know? What do you need? How can we fix it? Instead, we go right into the, well, you're not going skiing on Saturday because you need to go home and study. It doesn't exactly encourage honesty from the child the next time they may have a failing grade. Instead of saying, what's not working for you? Is it going too quickly? The process? Do we need to get you some help? Do we need to talk to the teacher? Do we need to figure this out? And that idea of blame, which feels a lot better and can be a lot easier to do right away, doesn't always get you to success. So think about your own failures and how people are treating those and how you're treating others. This next one I really love because it goes back to the idea of what my son had to do and what he didn't want to do necessarily right away at the sand dunes, which was try again. Because we have a lot of motivation to try the first time or maybe the second time. But after a while, when it's not working, it just kind of gets exhausting and you think, maybe this just isn't me. Maybe I'm better to just move on. In the book, they focus a lot about this example. And I'm wondering how many of you have some kind of a Dyson appliance in your house or know someone who does. If you think of that, the inventor James Dyson did not get to this point easily. They worked through so many prototypes to make the very first vacuum cleaner they did. So many attempts. There were 5,127 attempts before they got to the first Dyson vacuum cleaner that they felt was truly different enough to stand out. You put it another way, there were 5,126 iterations that did not work. I don't know about you, but I have yet to have an employer who would probably say, I'm going to give you 5,126 chances to get it right. You know, we might be lucky if we get 5 chances. But the question is, why are you giving up on yourself as you're trying to get there? What is it that you could do if you just kept trying it a bit more? And I would love for you to listen to what James Dyson said as he tried to explain this and put yourself in this and say, what goal is worth it to me to keep trying? What can you do to be like James Dyson?
There's a myth about inventors that all you need is one good idea and you'll make your fortune. But the fact of the matter is, you don't have ideas like that. Well, you start with a problem that you're having to solve, and you start building prototypes, hundreds of them, perhaps even thousands of them. And very often the original idea or the original problem doesn't look anything like the final solution. So the important thing is this journey from prototype to prototype. And during that process, of course, you get hundreds or thousands of failures. And the failure is the starting point, because when something fails, you understand why it fails, and then you start to think of ideas as to ways you can overcome that failure. I mean, the cyclones for my vacuum cleaner took over 5,000 prototypes. That's 5,000 failures before I'd cracked it. So the moral of the tale is keep on failing. It works.
I don't know that many of us have a inspirational poster up in our home office that says keep on failing, it works. But there really is something to this idea of what is it that keeps you going? What do you care enough about that you want to keep working on it? That can be especially important. So as we're thinking about how to get from failure to fearlessness, these are the 4 ways that I think one of them may work for you. The idea of marginal gains, opening up your feedback loop a little bit, the idea of trying not to blame someone, but looking to learn from what they're doing, and the idea of trying again. And so what I would love for you to do as you're going away from this is hold yourself accountable and think about the last time that you saw failure. This might be within something you did, something as simple as a recipe that didn't work, or a parenting moment that failed, or you weren't living up to what you felt like you wanted to do as a volunteer opportunity. Or it could be something within your work that you're saying, this system isn't working, especially right now during a pandemic when systems are being so disrupted. Where do you see failure? And how might it be changed by starting to implement one of these things? This can be so productive to do, especially with work. If you have some time on your next work call, take a look and go through one of these and say, what isn't working and what can we do better? There's a really important story about this that I want to leave you with before we start doing some questions. And it goes back to what was happening a little more than a decade ago when someone moved from Boeing to Ford. And so you picture this. We all know what it's like when a new boss comes in. Nobody wants to be the one to say, "Hey boss, things aren't really working so well," because you don't want to look like the person who's the complainer or the person who can't get it done. Everyone wants to look like they are the succeeder and the person that can be counted on. And so this manager, Alan Mullally, was basically saying, hey, everybody, we've got these 3 colors. We want you to show green if everything's all systems go. As we're taking a look at our reports, do yellow if we've got some concerns and maybe something we should talk about, and do red if something is just flat out failing. So he put those expectations out there and had the first meeting, and take a guess what happened as they went around the room and everyone reported on what they were doing. Basically, everyone said, green, green, green. Check, check, check. We've got it. We are on it. It's great news, one would think, that a boss would say, well, this is wonderful. I'm glad things are going so well. But this manager, CEO, knew that, listen, they had lost billions of dollars at Ford in the year before. And so clearly, if that's happening, it's not all green, 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 all systems go. And so he asked this question, isn't anything not going well? Instead of saying, how are things going? And everybody said, great. He asked, isn't anything not going well? And with that, it opened up a conversation, and suddenly people started to say, well, here are some yellows that we're concerned about. And eventually, it opened up the conversation in a way that people were not considered failures in bringing it up. They were considered successes because they were helping to point out what could be fixed. So if you're thinking about how can I get my team to investigate this? How can I look at myself and say, how do I do this? You may not want to say, hey guys, where are we failing? Hey team, where are we not doing things? Because nobody really wants to say that. That feels bad. That can set us up unintentionally for that blame game that's such a reality. But if you ask yourself, isn't anything not going well? Do I feel like I'm not getting enough sleep? Do I feel like I'm not giving enough me time or eating healthily enough or working on those long term projects or learning that extra language that I was wanting to do to help me with my job? Isn't anything not going well? Can open up these new conversations and some vulnerability with how to succeed. F is often thought of as maybe a swear word, but a swear word that comes with failure. The F word is not a place where we normally want to live. But I really want you to go beyond thinking of failure and starting to say F can be really favorable. It can be fantastic, fascinating. F can take us into the future if we're looking at it the right way. F really can be fearlessness. And I think that that's an important place to be, a place where I would encourage you to take this time when we're only 3 weeks into a new year to see how can you take the F word differently. I want to take a question that I'm just seeing popping up, and thank you for sharing it on the chat. And I'm going to read it to you as we go with this, and then would love to get anybody's thoughts on this to weigh in on chat for an answer. I'll weigh in, but I would love to hear from others as well. The question is, I'm a new sales guy assigned to an existing client. No matter how much I try, I'm unable to build and gain the complete trust of the client manager. And this has never happened in 30 years of sales experience. Is this failure? Is this because I'm unable to meet the client in person because of COVID restrictions? We all know how hard that is. Is there anything you would recommend I do differently? Thank you for putting in that question because I think it's so honest. And I think the first place most of us would go to ourselves would say, of course, this is a failure. I haven't been able to get this person to trust me. What's interesting is I read it, I think, of course you're not a failure. Like how do you ever get 100% trust from anybody? How do you get into this? So my quick answer to your question is I don't think this is a failure, but you may be starting to look at it a different way. Is it because you're unable to meet the client in person? I'm working with so many people who say it's really hard to feel like you're making the same connection with your clients, with your customers these days, because we don't have that ability to look each other really in the eye. We don't have the ability to just shake hands and have trust. And we don't have the chance to have random conversations because we've got 30-minute calls back to back and we lose out on some of that human touch that we have. So I do wonder if one of the things that you need to do differently is looking at how you build the relationship just beyond the business itself. I say this because I've been actually doing a video series where I'm talking to senior leaders at another Fortune 500 company, and they've been talking about, I asked them, what's your word of the year for 2021? And they keep giving me individually some kind of an offshoot of the word connectivity or dependability, that they feel like what people really need to be focusing on the year ahead is how do you build those connections and that trust with people when you don't have regular ways. And they're talking about doing things like sharing what they're good at. They've had people share their vacation videos, or if they're learning to play the guitar, they have them say, here's what I'm doing during COVID to help my mental health. They're having them do book clubs. So they start to share ideas, even though they're not sharing a meal in the lunchroom. And so the advice I give to you is the idea of is there a way that you can start thinking differently to build your connections beyond what you would traditionally do, to pull in those things even though we're on a screen. Does anybody else have ideas for this person about how they might be able to build connectiveness, and is it a failure?
It sounds like that was a great response, but we do have another question if you'd like to hear it.
Sure.
We have someone who says, failure is the mother of success, a Chinese proverb. However, there is a cost from failure to an organization or a person. So is it a balance of failure versus risk versus cost, etc.? Any comment on that one?
I think you're absolutely right. And thanks for asking the question. It's kind of what I said at the beginning. No organization is going to encourage failing a lot, failing in ways that cost money. Nobody has time or resources for that. But I think it is, as you're balancing the idea of, if people are so focused on only succeeding, what is the cost of that? If they're going with what they know because they know they're 100% good at it, are you losing out from what they might be able to do if they were better? And I think that that's part of what's important in this conversation. And if you're intrigued by this, I would encourage you to read the book and look for ways to continue to apply this. If you're operating in such a safe space all the time that you feel like you're succeeding all the time, are you really? Right? If you are never taking on new projects, if you're never pushing yourself to grow a little bit, are you being all that you can be as an employee? Are you doing all you can for the company? So it is balancing risk versus reward. But if you're 100% in the safe space, you may not be getting to where you need to be for that next career move, or getting the company to a place of trying something new. Any other ideas on how you can build successes? If we think of that original question, how you can build trust with a client when we can't succeed in the way that we traditionally have done because of a pandemic? I think this is a good point that Chris Broder brings up, is you have to ask them questions about them to learn. And that's part of the closed loop, right? I think we all fall into this, the idea of, for 30 years, it's worked. I've never had a client that didn't do this. And so we put it on ourselves that clearly we must be failing. This may just be a different client in a different time with different needs. And so instead of failure, it's an opportunity to change how you can connect with them and succeed. I think the idea is just that what we have done before prepares us to get where we are, but it may not always be the key of what gets going ahead. I think also this idea, find what interests them, share some news and articles of interest in those areas. I do that with clients all the time. I'll see something that reminds me of a conversation we had and say, hey, just read this really interesting article in the New York Times. I did this on Monday. I sent it to a client and said, look at this article. This has to do with something we were talking about. This would be great food for thought. It built a relationship between us, not that it leads to a direct job or a direct success, but it certainly builds that trust in a different way. And I think this is part of it. Someone else has a great idea about offer no lose options. Maybe you want to think about how you pitch things differently, especially if you have confidence in your success. Show them the confidence. If they're not satisfied with the product, offer a full refund, right? That can be a different way of in some ways, marginal gains, of saying, let's try this a different way. The way that I've built a relationship with them and pitched them doesn't seem to be working, so let's try something else. Let's go for the Dyson method of try again. Try a different way of doing it and see if that gets you farther. I think as we wrap up, first of all, I want to thank all of you for taking time to do this, because it's kind of a downer on paper to say we're going to look at how you can fail and fail better, because we would all love to live in a world of successes. But as Rebecca said at the beginning, we also don't want to live in a world of coulda, woulda, shouldas. We don't want to live in that world of, if I had done this differently, would that have got me the promotion? Would that have got me the day off that I needed because I worked a little harder one day so I could have a Friday or a Saturday that I could just not check my phone? Could it have gotten me doing something that I felt good about? Or even just if I picked up a new recipe, could that have made me feel like I had a sense of accomplishment that I wouldn't have had if I had just ordered pizza again on a Thursday night like I had done for weeks before? Failure sucks, but fearlessness is so much more empowering and can take you so much farther. And so I really hope that from this, you're embracing a way to give yourself a little bit of grace, be proud of what you are doing, and look at the ways that you can frame it differently to show people and show yourself what you can accomplish when you don't let that fear of the F word get in the way. If you have any questions, you can reach me at this point. I will work to get the article from Harvard Business Review out to you so that you can see it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm so glad that you are all here. And if you've got stories that you want to share of turning the F word from fear into fearlessness, from failure into fearlessness, please share them with me and with Biko. It would be great to be able to share your success stories as well.
Emily, if it's okay, we've got a couple minutes. Could I ask a couple questions now?
Absolutely.
We have someone who wants to know, is it okay that I can just directly ask, what can I do to gain your trust?
I think that that's an interesting question. I like when people listen. I come from a journalism background, so my bias is I like hard questions, and I think that that could be a good way to do it. But consider, will that, are you bringing up a situation that they may not even be aware of? They might not trust you, and so you may want to look at a different way to ask the question. You can go for directness, or you can also look for a way of, what would make you feel more comfortable with this? You may want to approach it a bit differently in case the way you see it as a failure may not be the way they're viewing it.
Okay, great. And we've got another one that says, when do you give up or keep pushing ahead? Where does that edge begin and stop?
I think you have to know, right? Like, look at Joe Biden. Again, not a political statement, but he went from being the youngest senator. He was 30 years old when he became a senator, to now being the oldest president. He spent 48 years in between getting to this point. Some people would have said, especially when he came in 4th in the Iowa caucuses and came in 5th in the New Hampshire primaries, they probably would have said, you've had it. It's time to give up. He wasn't willing to do it. So I think one of the things about that, and I say that not as a political statement, but as one to try to answer that question, when you give up is when you feel that your heart's in it no longer, that you want to try something else. The person that I talked about in that video that we focused on who failed, they didn't want to give up. They believed in that project, but eventually they looked at the data and they said, this isn't worth the energy of myself or the company anymore. It's better to say, I tried, it didn't work, now what can I do next? Than to just keep trying to push something that didn't seem like it was going to make sense. So I think part of it is that honesty of balancing where your passion is and what you believe you can do versus, are you doing it because you just don't want to admit you're wrong? At that point, you may want to say, what's the next thing I can succeed at? Let's fail fast so we can start to succeed even more quickly.
Amazing insight. Thank you so much. And that is the conclusion of our questions. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. A special thanks to you, Emily, for your time and insight. If you all would like to watch this again, it's available on beconet.com/flourish, where you can also view the rest of our sessions as well. We hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Be well. Thank you.